Released on November 14, 2006, Eragon for the PlayStation 2 was part of a broader multimedia effort to capitalize on the popularity of the fantasy novel by Christopher Paolini, and its film adaptation. Released in December of the same year, developed by Stormfront Studios, the game had the challenging task of adapting both the book and the movie, trying to strike a balance between faithful representation and the inherent limitations of the hardware. Although Eragon aimed to deliver an action-packed experience true to the spirit of its source material, it ended up falling into the trap of being a competent, but largely generic action-adventure game. The Eragon video game came about as part of a larger marketing push to accompany the release of the Eragon film adaptation. The film was expected to draw in both fans of the book series and general moviegoers, so a video game was a natural extension of this multi-platform release strategy. Stormfront Studios, a developer known for titles such as The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers and NASCAR 98, was tasked with developing the game, leveraging its experience with fantasy action adventure games to try and capture the feel of Eragon's world. The game was developed under a tight deadline, as is often the case with movie tie-ins. This restricted development cycle had noticeable effects on the game's final product. While the game wasn't outright broken or incomplete, it lacked the polish and innovation that could have set it apart from the myriad of other fantasy action-adventure games released during the period. Stormfront Studios' primary goal was to ensure the game remained faithful to the Eragon film, which in itself was a condensed and more cinematic version of Paolini's original novel. While this focus helped create a cohesive narrative experience for those familiar with the film, it also constrained the game's ability to explore more expansive or unique gameplay elements.
The game was first announced in early 2006, with Ubisoft publishing the title across various platforms, including the PlayStation 2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo DS. The PlayStation 2 version, arguably the most significant release, launched in North America on November 14, 2006. Just weeks ahead of the film's debut on December 15, 2006. This was a common tactic for film tie-ins, allowing the game to serve as both marketing and merchandise for the movie's release. At its core, Eragon is an action-adventure hack-and-slash game, heavily inspired by other fantasy titles that had gained traction in the early to mid-2000s. One of the most immediate comparisons to draw is with The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, which Stormfront Studios had developed in 2002. Like The Two Towers, Eragon employs a mix of swordplay and ranged attacks, with the latter coming from Eragon's ability to use magic and his bow. The gameplay loop is simple. Players control Eragon as he fights through waves of enemies using a combination of melee attacks, magic, and archery. The combat system is functional but lacks depth. The sword fighting mechanics are straightforward, relying on light and heavy attacks, as well as the occasional combo. However, as the game progresses, the combat quickly becomes repetitive, despite the developers' efforts to introduce new abilities and combat techniques. The core gameplay never evolves beyond the initial mechanics. This is a problem many similar hack-and-slash games from the era struggled with, as they try to deliver action without providing much variation or complexity. Eragon also features a few platforming sections, which were likely inspired by other action-adventure titles like Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time or God of War. These segments are serviceable, but fail to deliver the excitement or fluidity seen in their more accomplished counterparts. The level design in Eragon is fairly linear, and while it does a decent job of guiding players through key moments of the movie, it lacks any sense of discovery or exploration that fans of the book might have hoped for.
One of the main selling points of the game was its fidelity to the movie's storyline. Stormfront Studios worked closely with the filmmakers to ensure that the major plot points and characters from the film were faithfully recreated in the game. This is most evident in the game's cutscenes, which use footage directly lifted from the Eragon movie. These cinematic sequences help provide context for the game's levels, but they also emphasize the fact that the game's story is almost entirely reliant on the film's plot, limiting its scope and originality. The voice acting in the game features several of the movie's actors, including Ed Speleers as Eragon. While this adds a degree of authenticity, the voice performances often feel flat, likely due to the rushed nature of development and voice recording. Still, The inclusion of the actual movie cast helps to tie the game into the broader Eragon media universe, even if the execution isn't always perfect. However, in trying to be faithful to the movie, the game suffers from a lack of depth. The Eragon novel is known for its rich world building and detailed lore, but much of that is glossed over in the game. What's left is a fairly shallow representation of Alagadursa, which might disappoint players who are hoping for a more immersive experience akin to something like The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, which was released earlier, in 2006 and set a high standard for open-world fantasy games. Perhaps the best way to describe Eragon on the PlayStation 2 is competent, but generic. The game functions as expected. There are no game-breaking bugs or technical issues, and the controls are responsive and easy to learn. The problem is that there's nothing particularly memorable or unique about it. The combat system is serviceable, but as mentioned earlier, it becomes repetitive very quickly. The magic system, which allows Eragon to cast basic spells to damage enemies or solve simple environmental puzzles, doesn't add enough variety to make the combat more engaging.
The AI of both enemies and companions is fairly basic. Enemies tend to attack in predictable patterns, making combat feel more like a chore than a challenge after the first few levels. The game also includes some sections where Eragon is accompanied by Brom or other key characters, but these allies don't significantly impact the gameplay. They're mostly there for narrative purposes, occasionally helping in combat, but their inclusion doesn't add any real strategic depth to the game. As the core of the game, combat in Eragon is a mixed bag. While the mechanics are sound, they lack the nuance or complexity seen in more polished action games. Players will find themselves using the same combos and abilities over and over again, with little incentive to experiment with new tactics. The enemies, while varied in design, don't require much in the way of strategic thinking. Most battles can be won by spamming the same attack patterns, and the boss fights, while more challenging, follow predictable patterns that don't provide much of a thrill. There's also a sense that the developers were aware of the limitations of the combat system. As a result, they tried to break up the monotony by including a few on-rails dragon riding sections, where players control Saphira as she flies through the skies. These segments provide a brief reprieve from the ground-based combat, but they're too few and far between to make a lasting impact on the overall experience. In the end, Eragon for the PlayStation 2 is a competent, if unremarkable, action-adventure game. It does a decent job of following the film's plot and incorporating familiar characters and locations from the Eragon universe, but it never rises above the level of a typical movie time. The combat, while functional, becomes repetitive quickly, and the game's linear level design and lack of innovation make it feel dated, even by 2006 standards. For fans of the book or film, Eragon might offer some fleeting enjoyment, but it's unlikely to leave a lasting impression. It's a game that works, but fails to inspire a generic fantasy experience that doesn't quite live up to the potential of its source material.